Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be discussing the philosophy of space. Part 1, the Fermi Paradox. Now, so a few months ago we promised we would try out some longer form videos here on the channel. However, with this video, we might have gone a little bit overboard even for that. So we're going to be splitting it up into 3 parts to make it a little bit more manageable. Each part is going to come out on its own, and then we're going to publish a complete video with everything. Hope you enjoy the philosophy of outer space. Today we're going to be diving into the philosophy of outer space. Now, often when philosophers talk about the philosophy of space, they mean space in the metaphysical sense, the 3 dimensions that we live in. However, there are also important philosophical questions to be answered about outer space, the parts of space that are not Earth. Some of these questions are for science, but they do have philosophical implications, like whether or not there is life on other planets. Some of them are ethical questions that fall clearly into the realm of philosophy. How should we interact with aliens if we encounter them? Others are epistemic questions for the philosophy of science, like whether the methods we use to study outer space are actually epistemically justified, given that we can't actually perform tests on the vast majority of the universe. Others still fall in between various components of science, philosophy, and religion, like how did the universe start? Are there multiple universes or just one? In this video, we're going to cover all these questions and more. The Earth makes up at most only a very small percentage of the matter in the universe, but this is the subject of the vast majority of philosophy. Let's today take a second to talk about the other 99.9999999, etc. percent. So, first we're going to start with the Fermi Paradox. So, are we alone? The first question for us to tackle is perhaps the earliest question that one might ask upon looking up into the night sky. Are we alone in the universe? Now, there are a range of ways that this question can be approached. One might argue that the universe is insanely vast, and therefore there must be other life out there somewhere. Basically, this is the intuition behind the claim that if you get enough monkeys and enough typewriters, they'll eventually write the complete works of William Shakespeare. The universe seems very vast, even just looking at it from the Earth. The more we study it, the larger and larger it seems to be, to the point of possibly even being infinite. It seems like with such a large amount of space and a large number of planets, there have to be other planets that have been able to support life. However, on the contrary, there are elements of life that seem so unique and so hard to reproduce that despite the gigantic size of the universe, it's not likely that life has emerged anywhere else. Even if someone can assess how big the universe is, they're going to struggle to determine the likelihood of life, let alone intelligent life emerging, because those are processes that take hundreds and thousands of years to happen. And so we have this problem of we have a huge number of possible places life could emerge, but also a very low likelihood of the actual processes of life happening. So, one might also argue that this is a question for science and not philosophy at all. If you give science enough time, they can look at all the planets and just see if there's life on them. But this once again runs into the problem of just how vast the universe is. Not only does this size make it difficult to travel to the planets and check for life, it makes it hard to even be confident that we have looked at enough planets to be sure there is no life anywhere. We can't even observe most of the universe. This is especially true since the visible part of the universe is very small, if not infinitesimally small compared to the rest of the universe. Also, epistemically, it's very hard for science to prove that something does not exist. Even if you did check every single planet, it would be tough to say that there is absolutely no life anywhere else in the universe using inductive methods, and so we may need some deductive philosophy to bring to bear on it. Even if we use science to figure out what planets would be suitable for life like ours, then only check those for signs of life, we have the problem that life might look very different on other planets. Even if we are successful at eliminating the possibility for life that looks very much like us, it may be impossible for us to be assured that life which looks very different, which is perhaps not even based in matter, but based in energy only, or based on very different kinds of elements and molecules and existent in very different environments. thriving under very different conditions doesn't exist, because those could be the very conditions that are inimical to our life and that we couldn't even go into to check if we wanted to. Now, in from this comes Enrico Fermi. A different way to approach this question comes from the Fermi Paradox. The paradox can be framed in a range of different ways, but here's one of them. There are and have been many potentially habitable planets that could develop life. We see this when we look up at the stars. There are many planets that seem to be in the position or have the correct elements such that life might be possible. Earth is not the youngest of such planets, so life should probably have developed somewhere else, given that we are not the first of such planets to exist. There are other planets that could support life, many, many other planets that could support life that have been around longer. If life developed somewhere else, then we should see evidence of it somewhere. Maybe probes sent to Earth, structures on distant planets, electromagnetic waves, or even a radio signal at all. But we don't see any evidence of other life. In other words, where is everybody? Let's look at each of these premises in turn. So, there are other planets that could sustain life. As with anything in the universe, this is hard to estimate and even harder to know with certainty. However, scientists estimate that there are tens of billions of Earth-like planets in the Milky Way galaxy alone, and there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. Based on this, it seems that there are many other planets with the same conditions to sustain life. Next, Earth is not the youngest or the first planet that could fit these descriptions. Scientists have evidence, based on the age of the universe, that Earth is not the first planet to be able to sustain life. It is not as if this were a common process and we were just the first to be on a planet that could support life, since there have been billions of other planets, many of which are younger than Earth, which could have, and so if they followed a similar process, should have supported life. Therefore, we should see some evidence of galactic civilizations. If there was life on other planets, we should see some evidence of it. Radio waves on Earth have only been transmitting for a short period of time, but have already traversed over 100 light years in space. Even if a society died off long ago, we should be getting echoes of their existence as they became able to transmit information. We would also think that a powerful enough society would soon start to occupy other planets, would expand throughout the galaxy, and would eventually expand throughout the universe, such that we would start to see physical evidence of their presence. Even if that society died off, we should see the relics that they created, the existing radio waves that are broadcasting through space. We should see pieces of that society, even if it existed long ago. But we don't see any evidence yet of aliens. Setting aside conspiracy theories, we don't yet have any real evidence of life elsewhere in the universe. We certainly don't have evidence of a big galactic civilization that's coming to conquer all the planets in the solar system or put an intergalactic highway through planet Earth. We seem to be the only ones putting out messages into space. Despite doing a lot of work to listen very closely to the stars, we have never heard anything, much less observed physical evidence of other societies. Now, it's an interesting parallel to this, which is the question of where are all the time travelers? So, a quick aside, there's a corollary to the Fermi Paradox for time travel, which simply asks, if backwards time travel is possible, where are all the time travelers? Most works of speculative fiction that include time travel need to have some explanation for this. Perhaps time travel is not possible to years prior to the year that time travel was invented. Perhaps time travel creates a new branch of the universe, and you can only travel backwards along that new branch, not to the original main timeline. Perhaps time travelers have visited, in fact, but there are enough rules or technology that prevent them from being noticed or interfering with our time. Well, it's an interesting corollary to the Fermi paradox, and some of the solutions may have either isomorphic similarities, such as the zoo, or the same solution can solve both, such as the simulation. A full treatment of the philosophy of time and time travel is going to need to await another video. The first of these solutions that we'll look into is called the Great Filter. So, the question here is, what stopped the galactic empire? Life, as we understand it, likes to spread, to replicate, to make more of itself in every possible crack and crevice it can find. So it makes sense that, provided with sufficient time, it would spread beyond its own planet. This is a slight variation on the Fermi Paradox, as it asks not just why we haven't seen any evidence of any life elsewhere, but why have we not seen a galactic civilization, a civilization that exists on all planets in a galaxy? One explanation for this paradox is offered by Robert Hansen and is sometimes called the Great Filter. This argues that there is some stage at the process of achieving galactic domination that is very, very hard to overcome. That even if there are many situations where the conditions of life are right, or the conditions are right for intelligence, or the conditions are right for civilization, that there is at least one stage in that process somewhere that is so hard to overcome that even if there are billions upon billions of possible places it could happen, it rarely happens, and it may have only happened once. Hansen puts forward 9 steps on the journey to galactic colonization, any of which could be the very unlikely one that limits the billions of planets that could support life to so few we have never yet seen any that have achieved galactic dominance. This question then becomes, is this great filter behind us, implying that humankind is the 1 in a trillion civilization that made it through? Or in front of us, meaning that there are other civilizations out there that have reached our level or gotten close to our level, but there's some great filter in front of us that is going to mean we face a full extinction or some actual barrier to complete galactic conquest. Let's take a look at the filters. So, the first step is something we can test for to a certain degree. Does a planet have the right conditions for life to form? We do observe many planets with such conditions. Now, we can only observe so many conditions about a planet, and we can only understand its environment to a certain degree. We can understand how far away from it is it from particular stars in a particular habitable zone, perhaps what elements are present within the solar system that we're looking at, but there are some conditions that we perhaps can't understand. Maybe there are particular features of our planet that made it ripe for life that we're unable to observe in distant planets. And so we may be overestimating the number of planets out there that have the right conditions for life. A commonly supposed place for the Great Filter is at the stage of what's called abiogenesis. This is the question of how we go from chemistry to biology. How do we go from individual chemical reactions that do not self-replicate themselves into a self-replicating process? A full discussion of abiogenesis deserves another video, but scientists think that the conditions of the early Earth were such that the necessary lipids, proteins, and RNA were able to form and given millions of years and trillions of individual molecules, eventually one of them formed a self-replicating cell. However, this is a rare thing to happen. We have not been able to reproduce abiogenesis, and so this could be the great filter that we're looking for. The next step up from just self-replicating RNA is supposed to be prokaryotes, which look like our modern bacteria. This is sometimes combined with the previous step, as some suppose that you would need the conditions of a modern prokaryote for abiogenesis to happen, while others argue that we might have had much simpler cells when life first started before millions of years of evolution made bacteria more complex. Eukaryotes are more complicated cells that are found in animals and plants. These cells have within them organelles which make the work of producing energy much more efficient. It is supposed that these eukaryotes evolved through a symbiotic relationship between mitochondria, an organelle that in many ways resembles a prokaryote. They have their own DNA, etc., and the larger eukaryote, perhaps eating but not completely digesting it, perhaps developing, kind of going from a parasitic to a symbiotic relationship, we're not sure. This is another stage that is often supposed as the great filter, since such a symbiotic relationship developing, which had such a substantial boost for productivity for the eukaryote cell, may be unlikely. The next potential filter, according to Hansen, is moving from asexual reproduction of a single cell dividing itself to sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction gives greater opportunity for variation that can lead to evolution, since it means that cells are not relying solely on mutations to change DNA, but can have greater diversity in populations and therefore greater opportunities for beneficial changes. And even cells can select their potential future mates based on particular characteristics such that they have a better ability to evolve and replicate those beneficial characteristics. Another step in the process is moving from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms. Some suspect that this may have taken place when a group of single-celled organisms grouped together and then began to specialize and gained benefits from this specialization. A rare enough instance that this may be the great filter itself. The next supposed step is that we need animals who have cognitive functions sophisticated enough that they can use tools. Brains are evolutionarily costly things, and while they pay off in the long run, it may have been just luck that we evolved with them, and that they were actually able to stick around long enough for us to really put them to use. The next step is planetary dominance. This is often framed as the stage that we are in now, moving from using tools to being the dominant form of life on the planet, capable of manipulating other life forms to our own will. Because we don't know exactly what the next step in the process is, we don't know what about our current stage is crucial. What about it might be considered a great filter? Perhaps it's industrialization, perhaps it's farming, perhaps it's something else we haven't gotten to yet in terms of technology. There could be components that are necessary and others that are superfluous to whatever is needed to take that next step. The next step, once we have conquered our own planet, according to many theorists, is galactic dominance, colonizing other planets and spreading throughout the solar system. Unfortunately, we don't know what that next filter will be because we haven't made it past them yet, nor do we know if the great filter actually lies behind us or if it lies ahead, perhaps at the step of moving to other planets, or maybe it's moving outside of our own solar system. Maybe species can colonize a solar system, but then there's some filter out there that we haven't realized yet that stops them from going beyond their solar system, or perhaps leads them to collapse completely. Now, there's some concerns with this idea of the great filter. First, it might be the case that there is no one great filter, but actually many individual smaller filters. As much as narratively it's interesting if there's one great filter that's cutting us off, it could be possible that simply combining a bunch of very unlikely instances leads to us having an unlikely probability. It could be that every step in this process is unlikely on its own. There's no one that is impossibly unlikely. It's only when they're put together that they become so monumentally unlikely we find ourselves as the only life we can see. Second, in the other direction, even if it is the case that there is a great filter behind us, that doesn't imply that there's not also a great filter in front of us. Even if we are the only ones to ever get this far, it's possible that the next step is even harder, if not impossible. A third concern that could be raised is whether all forms of life would really strive for galactic dominance. Maybe it's not a filter that kills us off in front of us, but some change in values or ideals that leaves all societies to not attempt to go out and conquer the galaxy in some way. Or maybe many forms of life do evolve, but those forms of life look very different than our form and don't try to populate all the planets. There are other concerns that could be raised. We might worry that there is not just one path that life could move down, and that there may be many other galactically dominant species we don't even recognize because they are so different. We might think that we are not, in fact, close to the final step in the process, that there are many more steps before us. And even if there is not a future great filter out there, there may be many small filters that could stop us, similar to the possibility of many small filters behind us. Next, let's take a look at another answer to the Fermi paradox, sometimes called the zoo. Also called the prime directive. Another explanation of the Fermi paradox is often described as the zoo, but it can be explained easily through the Star Trek prime directive. This is the idea that there may be some set of rules out there that prevent advanced societies from communicating with societies that are not sufficiently advanced yet. Perhaps these societies are able to hide themselves from our observation, or are even required to by galactic laws. Perhaps their technology is something that we can't even detect or see. In this case, we are in the zoo. There's some point in the future where we will graduate out of the zoo if we become advanced enough. Maybe that means sufficiently advanced space travel, or the discovery of a new type of communication system that would mean we can actually detect communications from these super advanced societies that we previously couldn't detect. Perhaps that means we need to evolve to a certain new form of life that would be able to engage with these societies. Fiction has imagined a range of ways that we could discover this and first encounter new alien species. We could also be the seed of a life planted by a large, very distant civilization, which expands throughout the universe by placing pockets of life, then leaving them alone to grow, or protecting them from the rest of the universe. This is a bit of a combination of this one and another answer to this theory, but it's a possibility we could understand, that perhaps we are that seed of life that was placed here as a very small, maybe the great filter is at the level of abiogenesis, and the species just placed us here as prokaryotes or eukaryotes to eventually populate the planet, and is purposefully leaving us alone to see how we evolve. Who knows? Now, there's some objections to the zoo theory. One concern with this explanation is that it becomes less and less likely as science becomes more advanced. Every scientific discovery that we make without discovering aliens makes it less likely that we will discover aliens with a future discovery. There are more sensors. The more sensors we create and find nothing, the harder it is for us to justify the belief that there are aliens that are progressively better and better at hiding. This theory makes a lot more sense in the 1800s than it does today. Even if there are strong regulations against it, most laws and regulations in our society are bent, if not outright broken. So it seems unlikely that we would have no information about such people, unless aliens are just much better at enforcing such laws. Just look at how many times Starfleet ships accidentally interact with such pre-warp civilizations to get a sense of why there's at least some questions here. Next up, in terms of responses to the Fermi Paradox, we have the simulation. So this is something that philosophers, particularly in epistemology, know well, and skeptics like myself. Another response to Fermi's paradox is to simply say that maybe we're in the Matrix, or something that is sometimes referred to as an ancestor simulation by scientists. The reason that we do not see any other species that have evolved on other planets is that we're not actually on a planet at all, but we're in a computer simulation. There are several reasons we might think that this is the case. If we imagine a sufficiently powerful civilization that wants to live over and over again and extend their life in different times and different places, we can conceive of them constructing a gigantic simulation where everything is fake. You might be a member of this civilization right now, but when you die, you simply wake up and perhaps enter another simulation, living hundreds of lives throughout your life. As video games and movies become more and more immersive, it's not hard to imagine how such a society might be created in a few thousand years, especially given that 1,000 years ago, our society was much, much more primitive. In fact, if this is a simulation, we're already creating simulations inside of it in the form of video games. We might conceivably already be several layers down within a simulation within a simulation. This would explain why there's nothing out there in space, simply because we didn't create anything out there for this simulation. Our simulation might be modeled after the real world, or it could be completely different than what the real world exists like 1, 2, or many levels above us within a simulation. Now, there are some objections to this explanation. One concern with this explanation is the claim that it would take monumental amount of computing power to simulate the entire universe, something that would be impossible to contain on Earth. Now, there are a couple of issues with this objection. First, it relies on a model where the simulation is recreating the entire universe. Practically, the simulation would only need to simulate anything that the people in the simulation were actually interacting with at a given time. It's rare for folks to interact with molecules anywhere other than planet Earth, and most of the molecules in planet Earth are on the inside, and we're not interacting with them on a daily basis. And one does not need to simulate them all to create the appearance of the sky whenever needed. Anyone that has looked at how objects far away in video games are poorly rendered can imagine how a simulation would not really need to simulate exactly everything, but rather just things that people in the simulation are actively interacting with. Another objection to this explanation is that such a reality would make most knowledge impossible. Knowledge by philosophical definition requires statements to be true. If we're in a simulation, any statements about the world are false. In fact, even the rules of math or logic could be different in the real world. However, this objection commits the fallacy of necessitation. Just because we want to have knowledge doesn't mean that we can actually have it. Doing so would beg the question against the skeptic. This explanation does raise more questions than it answers. We would know nothing about the real world. We would not know if we are one level down in a simulation, or 2 levels down, or even many more. But as a skeptic, if anything, it's a comforting possibility that when we die, we'll just wake up and discover that our whole life was simply a game, and that there are many more games we can play. Another solution to the Fermi Paradox is about communications. So, another possible explanation is that aliens have been communicating with us. We're just really bad at interpreting it. Perhaps what we take for background radiation is actually aliens on other worlds working very hard to communicate with us. This potential diversity of life may be hard to imagine. It might be hard to imagine that what we would conceive of as communication would look very different from what another society would conceive of as communication. But this potential diversity of method of communication can be very hard to conceive of. There could be beings that communicate very quickly or very slowly at such rates that it might take lifetimes for us to understand them, or we might pick them up as a single blip on a monitor. They could be communicating at a very different scale, very large or very small compared to what we do. And so we may not be picking them up because we're expecting something at our scale, either in terms of time or space, and we're capturing something very different. However, there are issues with this explanation. While it might explain why we haven't received communication from other aliens, it doesn't explain why there's not yet an intergalactic civilization. It also doesn't explain why life like us has not evolved elsewhere. Even if there is a range of diversity of life in the universe, why has life that at least somewhat resembles us not appeared elsewhere? Others claim that communications do importantly look different from natural phenomenon, regardless of the culture that you're coming from or the species that is evolved in a particular place. One can think of the Voyager record or the Pioneer plaque to compare. It's hard to imagine how an alien race encountering such creations would think of them as anything other than being made by an intelligent being with the attempt to communicate, even if they were not able to fully understand them. However, this may simply be a failure of our imagination. Perhaps the other life out in the universe doesn't even use physical objects in the same way that we do. Now, another answer to this problem is intelligent design. So, without digging too far into the philosophy of religion, it is worth noting that one of the explanations for the Fermi Paradox is intelligent design. Basically, the claim that one of the steps in the Great Filter is impossible to overcome without an all-powerful, all-knowing being guiding things. Proponents of such claim that therefore such a being must exist. Abiogenesis is a common step that is proposed for this theory because it seems like a particularly challenging thing to get over without it. Now, there are a range of concerns with this claim. First, it just pushes the problem up a step. If we're concerned about the improbability of human life showing up without a creator, we should be even more concerned about a likelihood of an infinitely more powerful being showing up without a creator itself. The second issue is that it does not do everything that the theists think it does. Aliens could be the creatures that guided our development. Life could have been seeded on this planet billions of years ago. That doesn't imply that it was your particular version of a particular deity that did it, or even a deity at all. Check out our videos on the teleological argument for the existence of God for more on these back and forth. Next up, related to this, let's talk about the ethics of galactic colonization. So, all of this raises some interesting challenges when it comes to the questions of whether we should do things like sterilize probes, rovers, and other craft that we send into space. Right now we do. Right now we try to eliminate any life that is on an object that we're sending into space. On the one hand, we care about learning if life has evolved on other planets. If it has, we don't want to contaminate life with the life that we have here on Earth. This is something like the zoo theory. We don't want to bring life to a place that it isn't. Some of this is driven by concerns that folks have with the way that different plants and animals have spread on Earth when humans have brought them to new continents. They have become invasive species in different ways. They become invasive, they can destroy natural life, etc. In other words, if the Great Filter is in front of us and there's a lot of life on other planets, we don't want to damage or destroy it. However, there is another argument. Imagine instead that the Great Filter is behind us, that we are the only species that has made it this far. Maybe the issue is abiogenesis, and nowhere else in the universe does any life exist. If that is the case, then we have the opportunity, if not the responsibility, to spread life throughout the galaxy. And we should be shooting extremophiles, life that can survive even in space, at every planet we can imagine. Because there is a good chance that we will mess up our own planet. There's a good chance that the only way that life will be able to get off the planet is if we help it. And we help it before we destroy ourselves. If the Great Filter is far enough behind us, then it was not unlikely that sentient life evolved from basic bacteria, but it's very unlikely that life started at all. If we want life to continue to exist, we should be doing everything we can to send it to every planet we can. Humans might not be able to get off this planet, but that doesn't mean that life can't. And we may be the only ones that are able to ensure that life continues to exist. Now, part of the issue here is time horizons. It took a very long time for us to reach each stage of the ladder described by the Great Filter. In our science fiction, we imagine that the processes of galactic domination is fast, that we will be terraforming Mars any day now. Some of this is for the same reason that cults who think the end of the world is coming always set the date within the near future, because they want to be relevant, because they want their short lives to be meaningful. But this might not be the case. It might actually take a huge monumental amount of time for this to happen. And the first step in that process might be sending bacteria to these other planets to get things started, because they may be the necessary precursors to getting plant life there, to eventually getting animal life there, to eventually getting intelligent life there. This terraforming process may take thousands, if not millions of years, and we may need to be doing it as soon as possible to set up perhaps not us, but perhaps a future evolved species to live. What if the terraforming takes centuries, and the first step is sending out microbes and getting them established? What if it is not humans that will survive to take over the cosmos, but the creatures that evolve from the microbes we send into the universe? What if the one thing stopping us is our desire for knowledge of whether there is other life instead of our preference for helping life to expand? The original thought experiment claims that life always tries to find more nooks and crannies to grow, but we're not doing that with the probes that we send out into space. But maybe that's another Great Filter in front of us. Maybe once a society becomes able to get into space, there's some desire to keep space clean that prevents them from expanding until it's too late, until they've used up their own planet's resources to be able to leave the planet or destroyed it. Now, this raises some very thorny ethical questions. What is our responsibility to life itself? Not just other humans, other animals, but the very possibility of living matter. Do we have a duty to help life continue on the universe if we're truly alone? And what is our responsibility to life on other planets? Do we risk infecting them if we spread the life we have? Or would they benefit from receiving more diverse life there, from understanding themselves that they are not alone? One of the key challenges with these questions is an epistemic one. What are the risks and what are the chances of each scenario? What are the odds that we are the only life in the universe? If they are high, if it's a high chance that the Great Filter is behind us, there seems to be a very good case for sending out extremophile organisms that can survive anywhere to ensure that we don't destroy our universe's only chance at life. By sterilizing our rovers, we could be dooming all life in the universe. But on the other hand, if there's a high likelihood that the life exists somewhere else and the Great Filter of some kind is in front of us, we could be doing great harm by sending what could become an invasive species or a new plague to another world. There's also the question of the size of the impact. Would the possibility of wiping out an entire planet with some microorganism be worth the benefit of possibly avoiding the complete extermination of all life in the universe, when we inevitably destroy our planet because we were too risk-averse to send life somewhere else, or when we simply collapse as a species and the life on our planet dies off when our planet is destroyed because we were the only ones that could have sent life somewhere else, because we were the only ones that were able to come up with any type of space travel. It's a thorny ethical question. Should we risk the possibility of losing all life in the universe at the risk of possibly creating a plague somewhere else that would destroy another planet? Last but not least, before we leave the inner part of our solar system, we have a question of the treatment of aliens, which connects to this ethical question. Should we make love or war? So a closely related ethical question to whether or not we should be spreading life throughout the galaxy is, what should we do if we actually encounter alien life? Should we embrace them or should we fight them? Should we hide from them or should we try to communicate from them? There are several factors that might lead us into leaning one way or another, and plenty of speculative fiction that can point us in one direction or another, in situations where people try to talk to the aliens destroy us, or people don't try to talk to the aliens, try to fight them, and the aliens were trying to be peaceful all along. We don't know. First, what if we encounter very basic life, something microscopic? We might be interested in studying it to understand how it's different from us or similar. We likely would want to contain it, at least it cause a pandemic or disease on our planet, or that we cause it particular harm. We'd probably also want to protect it from us and our diseases so it didn't lead to extinction. Experience of humans and other species coming into contact with each other after a long time apart has led to disastrous consequences in our past. There seems to be an ethical reason to preserve such life, such very basic life, both to expand our understanding, but also in case it provides some benefit to humans in the future. But we probably want to preserve that life in a very contained and quarantined environment, lest we cause more problems either for it or for ourselves. The next question would be, what should we do if we encounter a civilization that is similarly advanced to our own? Perhaps they are very different from us, but they have a similar level of technology. Should we fight them or try to make peace? Some understanding of this can come from political philosophy. It likely depends on their political structure. Democracies effectively never make war with other democracies, at least in our history. If they have such a system of government, then trying to make peace and trade with them is likely a good option. If they have a much more authoritarian structure, then war and conflict are more likely, so a stronger stance would probably be more effective. Learning about them and understanding the other society is an important precursor to making a decision of how we should deal with them. Though, depending on when they show up or how we find them, we may not have that opportunity. Now, we can take some lessons from game theory, particularly the iterated prisoner's dilemma. Check out our video on that for more. Consistently, the most effective strategy in the iterated prisoner's dilemma is something called tit for tat, starting with cooperation and then replicating the action of the other party. So assuming we have no information about what they're going to do, starting by trying to cooperate, and then if they attack us, attacking them back. This might be an effective strategy with another civilization on par with our own. Start with cooperation, but if they attack, respond in kind. We should also think about the principle of proportional response in war. If we are attacked, responding in kind to avoid a misunderstanding spiraling into a galactic war. What then if we encounter a more advanced civilization? Likely they would encounter us before we encountered them. They would probably visit us at home. It's hard to imagine what such a civilization would be like. We think that we have become more moral over time, that we've become more ethical. So perhaps we would hope that a more advanced civilization would be more moral even than we are now. However, perhaps our morals have held us back from technological advancements, and the society we meet will be bellicose and violent and try to take us for slaves or destroy us completely. In such a situation, we might be best served by gaining information or intelligence about the other society as soon as we can. The more we know, the better we can inform our response. Translation may be challenging, a set of philosophical problems in itself. There's likely not a single right response that would work in all situations, so getting as much information as we can to inform the decisions would be crucial. But it's also important to note that this, dealing with a more advanced civilization, is more a tactical problem than an ethical one. Since they are the more powerful society, they would therefore bear more of the ethical burden in how they act towards us, whereas our response is more around the tactics of how would we survive this interaction, as opposed to trying to figure out what the most ethical way to deal with them is. What do you think? What is the most probable solution to the Fermi Paradox? Should we clean our spacecraft or shoot extremophiles at every planet we can find? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org and stay skeptical, everybody.